Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Now, how to become a graduate student. So this outrageous gown that I'm sporting right now and this big fat book right here, I earned for doing a doctorate here at the University of Oxford, or what we call a DPhil, philosophy doctorate, whatever you want to call it. In Oxford they're called DPhils. I came here a long time ago to start this, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. So what I'm planning to do with this video is to tell you what those mistakes are so that you don't make the same ones. And if you're thinking of applying to Oxford for graduate school, if you get in touch with me in the comments, I'll provide you with all of the information, all the signposting you might need to help you with your application. Because honestly, I wish I had sought out more help when I was applying to graduate school. And there's lots of people out there whose job it is to help you. And so I'm gonna hopefully be a part of that. Now that gown is far too hot and uncomfortable to be wearing for the whole of this video, so I will not wear it for the rest of the time. So let's get into it. Where did I go wrong? Well, what am I talking about by going wrong? I applied for graduate school at Oxford twice. I was unsuccessful on the first occasion, and I basically made almost every mistake you could possibly imagine. I was fundamentally applying to Oxford for the wrong reasons. I was applying because I felt like I had something to prove. I wanted to put Oxford on my CV. I'd been rejected by Cambridge when I was 17, and I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, and I felt that this would prove the haters wrong, that if I got into Oxford, I would finally, be worth something. The haters were very much all in my head, and it was basically me and my insecurity that led me to apply to Oxford. And so I'm actually glad that it went wrong, because it encouraged me to sort of really assess why I was doing this. It sort of forced me to think about and analyse what my behaviour, what my sort of reasons for applying to Oxford were, and recognise that they were misguided, and to actually fall in love with the subject that I was interested in anyway, that I was applying for, which is politics, and then reapply, having taken a bit of time to recognise that actually it was a subject I should have been enamoured in, not the institution. If I'd applied with that love of politics and had gone through the steps that demonstrated that love and provided proof of that love and application and the possibility to study it at a high level, then I would have been admitted, because ultimately that's what happened at the second time of asking. So it all went wrong on the first time, it all went right on the second time. And so I'm going to talk you through the various stages as to what went right and what went wrong, so that hopefully you can be a bit more clearly informed. So just for a bit of background, Oxford admits about sort of 6,000 or so graduate students. Statistically, we have marginally fewer applicants per place for graduate study than we do for undergraduate study at Oxford University. So that might lead you to conclude that it's easier to be admitted for graduate study, and statistically it is, but it's only a tiny bit more straightforward. It's something like 1 in 6 applicants for postgraduate study will get in, as opposed to 1 in 7 for undergraduate study. It's still highly competitive, and the applicant pool for postgraduate study is much more internationally diverse. So we have students from all over the world, about 140 to 150 countries represented. Over 70% of applicants come from outside the UK. So although, strictly speaking, the number of applicants per place is marginally smaller than for undergraduate study, it's a very diverse and very accomplished cohort that you would be competing against. And that's important to recognise, because as with any application to a university like Oxford, it is going to be competitive, and you need to go into it with open eyes. You need to go into it assuming that, statistically speaking, you're less likely to get in than you are to get in, and go into it with a sense of sort of self-care, and not sort of go into it thinking, if I don't get in, this is going to be a disaster, it's going to show that I'm an awful human being, because no application in your life will ever do that unless you allow it to. So you need to be very careful, recognise that it's competitive, but still sort of very seriously consider giving it a go, simply because the benefits of trying, even if you don't get in, are enormous for your academic skills. So I would say, and you perhaps would argue, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But I would say it is worth going for, even though the odds of getting in are still relatively long. If you apply all of these tips and tricks that I'm about to tell you, then it should improve your chances of being admitted. So the first step is that with postgraduate study, it's important not to overgeneralise. In other words, the elements to success for admission to graduate degrees will depend entirely on the degree. So for undergraduate admissions, some of the videos I've made for that, I've provided more general advice about the sorts of thinking skills that we're looking for and the sorts of ways you can prepare yourself for admissions tests. And whilst there are some aspects we can generalise with regards to postgraduate study, there is a much greater degree of specificity between different courses. So perhaps the most obvious distinction is between PGT, postgraduate taught, and PGR, postgraduate research degrees. They are offering a completely different sort of set of skills and learning situations. And so overgeneralizing across the two will mean that your application isn't as strong. Your application needs to be really specific and incredibly well tailored to the course. And this is my top tip for the whole video, is that you need to apply as if it's a job you're applying for. And you need to very, very carefully look at the job description, or if you like, the how to apply section on the website for your chosen course, and follow that to the letter. I'll go into that in a bit more detail shortly, but there are a whole host of different degrees that we offer at the postgraduate level in Oxford, and the number of sort of initialisms becomes very confusing very quickly. So we've got the BPhil, which is for philosophy, and it's not a bachelor's degree, even though it sounds like it would be. We've got the MST, or Master in Studies, which is for several of our degrees. We've got MPhil, Master of Philosophy, and we've got DPhil, and there's a whole host more. So it becomes very, very confusing. And each of those is basically completely independent from each other. So overgeneralizing across all of the different degrees is quite dangerous. And that's why I was a little bit put off making this video, because I just thought I'd have to make, like, you know, as many different videos as there are different degrees out there, which might be a bit burdensome for everyone. There's also what are called DTCs, or doctoral training centres, so you can actually apply much more literally like a job, where you apply to become part of a research group. This is more typically for science subjects, but is also prevalent in doctoral training programs in various other parts of the university. So you need to be very careful. So how does this implicate you right now? Well, there are some general guidelines that sometimes are put out there, including that I have put out in previous videos, such as it might be a good idea to contact supervisors. Now that is, broadly speaking, true. It's not going to do you any harm if you do contact potential supervisors at the University of Oxford, but it's not actually a general requirement. If you're applying for the doctoral training centres, it's actually a very good idea to contact potential supervisors. If you're applying for a doctorate, then again, it's quite a good idea to at least identify potential supervisors and possibly make contact with them. But for some of the taught master's degrees, it's not required to contact supervisors. And indeed, in some faculties, they don't particularly encourage it. So English, for example, they wouldn't necessarily encourage you to reach out to potential supervisors. It won't do you harm. It's not as if you email some of the tutors that they will put a mark against your name and they will discourage your admission. So that's not going to cause you any harm, but it's also not going to help you. So if you're feeling anxious that you haven't heard back from an email you sent to a potential supervisor, it's not likely to matter for many of the degrees. So just be careful. As with everything to do with graduate studies, if it says on the website that you need something, then you need it. And if it doesn't, if it says you don't need it, you don't need it, okay? So for some of the courses on the website, and I'll link everything below in the description, it will say identify a particular supervisor. And of course, in that instance, you do need to do that, and it will be a good idea to try and make contact with that potential supervisor. But in many other cases, that won't be required, and so you don't need to get so worried about it. Okay. Another sort of thing that's very important with regard to generalization is that you shouldn't just reuse an application for different institutions at Oxford. Now, this is incredibly important. This is a major difference between undergraduate and postgraduate study at Oxford University. If you apply to Oxford as an undergraduate, then you apply via UCAS, which is the University Colleges and Admissions Service, and you use that to apply to all of your university choices, so up to 5. And you will use the exact same personal statement for all 5. They will all receive the same thing. And so you do have to provide quite a general statement of your interests and your direction of travel. For postgraduate study, you must not do that. You need to write a very specific statement of purpose and prepare a specific application for the specific degree that you are specifically applying for at Oxford. Okay? Indeed, even if you're applying for multiple degrees at Oxford, which is possible as a postgraduate, you need to make sure that each of those applications is entirely tailored to those individual degrees. Okay? This is very, very important. Okay? This is one of the mistakes I made when I was applying it first time around as a postgraduate. I basically thought I could throw in the same sort of application for every institution and it would be fine. And it wasn't, because I needed to make sure that I had absolutely tailored everything to the Oxford criteria. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that shortly. Specifically, you ought to treat it like a job application, as I mentioned, and you will find the job description, I mean, it's not literally a job description, but it's tantamount to a job description on the website. So if you go on to the graduate admissions website on the Oxford web page, and you search for a particular graduate degree, and you will find under the How to Apply tab some specific criteria such as these. So these are the criteria that are listed for a DPhil in ancient history, and these are indicative of the sorts of criteria that will be listed, but as mentioned, each degree will have different criteria, so make sure you check them individually. And when it says you will be assessed for your reasons for applying, the coherence of the proposal and so on, and it's got those bullet points down there, those are literally all of the things that will be assessed. Okay, there is a checklist and a marking scheme that the tutors will use, which will contain those criteria, and they will check your application against those criteria. Meaning that if you miss off any of those criteria when you've been asked to include them, then that will mean you lose marks. Okay, so you've got to answer all of these aspects. So just as if you're applying for a job, you can't just have one CV and throw it into 100 different companies and expect that will be successful. You need to tailor your CV to each of those 100 companies if you want to be successful. You need to look at their job description. You need to change your CV so that it fits the job description. That's how you get in, make sure that your CV is competitive for different jobs, and you need to do exactly the same for postgraduate teaching at universities like Oxford. So you need to go through each of those individual bullet points and address them all completely. Okay, it's very, very important. And note at the bottom it says your statement should focus on your academic qualifications to the extent that they are relevant to your academic plans rather than personal achievements, interests and aspirations. So some common mistakes is that people tend to talk about sort of extraneous details. They talk about, say, career successes that they have had or other ways in which that they are a successful and impressive human being. And given that in some cases they don't explain the relevance of that to their academic plans, it can't be taken into account. So you've got to make sure that you address everything that it says on the website. There's no subtext, just follow the instructions and follow them to the letter, and make sure you have a highly tailored application is my top tip. So what matters the most in your application? What are the sort of different criteria? So here are the 4 elements that are asked of for an English master's degree, which are taught master's degree. So again, the different degrees ask for different things. Some degrees ask for a test called the GRE, which may be required. In all cases, there may be an English language requirement, although that can be waived if someone has clearly studied in English previously. But nonetheless, these 4 criteria are fairly common across different degrees at postgraduate level. So referees, that is universal. All degrees require some referees. Some of you might be applying for postgraduate degrees straight out of an undergraduate course or another master's degree at a different university, or indeed from Oxford. But some of you might be applying for postgraduate teaching or research long after you've left formal education, and that's fine, right? So your referees are there to provide some sort of verification, some corroboration as to who you are and what your academic potential is. We also look for official transcripts, which are the tallying up of all of your marks as an undergraduate or for whatever degree you've most recently taken. We look for a statement of purpose quite commonly, but the length and the content of that will vary a lot. So this is an instance where you would have to click on the link where it says statement of purpose to find out precisely what they wanted. And in this instance, you're required to provide written work. So what matters the most? How are those put into the scales and weighed relative to each other? Well, they're actually interestingly weighed pretty much the same with the exception of referees. So referees is weighed the least, albeit it's still important, and the others are weighed exactly the same. So your performance as an undergraduate, in your official transcript, your proven academic track record is very important. Your statement of purpose is very important, especially for postgraduate research, where you're going to have a plan of action, basically, to say what sort of research you're likely to do, and you've got to make it clear that you can do it, it's feasible, and it's going to be of interest to someone. And your written work is very important. So interestingly, these are weighed basically the same, except for referees. For referees, we're looking to see that each of your referees can agree that you're pretty awesome, basically. If there's some sort of massive disparity, then that might cause a bit of concern. but it's still weighed slightly less because, of course, we know that references can come from all sorts of people, and it wouldn't necessarily be the most reliable source of data on your academic ability and potential. When I was applying, I basically lent entirely on the official transcript because I had performed well as an undergraduate. I'd come top of my year, and I had assumed that was basically going to be enough. And I didn't put remotely sufficient energy into the statement of purpose. I mean, I spent a lot of time on it, but I didn't tailor it at all. And with hindsight, it's really obvious why it didn't succeed. But at the time, I sort of thought, well, I'm applying to several places, and I kind of just want to use a general statement exactly like I did as an undergraduate, and I want to sort of say I did really well in my studies, and so surely that's enough. It wasn't because there were, another 6-7 applicants for the place I was after who were much better prepared. So, it's not surprising I didn't get in, but it was good that I didn't because it meant I could get better. So I don't regret it in the slightest. So ultimately, you're trying to prove that you're ready. You're ready to get going and take the most of the opportunity if you become a postgraduate student. For postgraduate teaching courses, do you have a case to make that you should come to Oxford rather than anywhere else? Now, this is where you need to be very clear, and I'll talk about this a bit shortly, that Oxford is the place for you. So again, unlike with undergraduate statements of purpose, or personal statements as we tend to call them, for postgraduate studies, you have to explain why Oxford. You have to tell us why you want to come to Oxford. What modules do you want to study here on the course? What particular tutors do you want to work with? What specific resources at the university do you want to use? And don't just say something really obvious like the Bodleian Library. Use something much more specific so that it shows that you're serious, that you know on day one where you're going to go. You've got a plan. You're going to know you're going to go directly. You're going to make a beeline for that particular resource that's going to make the most for your studies, okay? It's got to be really specific. For postgraduate research, you'll need to make it clear that you'll fit into a research group if you're applying for a research group, which is true for the sciences, natural sciences. Or you might need to make it absolutely clear that you have a research plan that is feasible and interesting to a prospective supervisor. Now, this is really hard, and this is, again, where generalization becomes really difficult because almost by definition, for postgraduate research, you can't sort of generally give people advice because they should be offering something which has never been seen before, or at least they're offering, an attempt to say something that's never been said before. In other words, when it comes to the level of, say, a doctorate, you're pushing the envelope, right? You're saying something new and fresh. And so it's very difficult to give someone general advice about how to do that because by definition, we've never seen it before. So it's tricky, but you've got to walk that tightrope between saying something that's interesting and engaging that your tutors, your prospective supervisors will think, that needs researching, that sounds really cool, but also something that is feasible, right? I mean, it's relatively straightforward to say something completely mad and unhinged that no one said before, but can you say something that could feasibly be researched and looked into? That's a bit more difficult. The surest way of doing so is to be very clear on what the current literature says. So be a bit of a copycat. Go and look at who's answering the same questions that you're interested in, how are they answering them, and how can you add a bit of value? How can you have a bit of a unique sales proposition, even in a relatively sort of crowded field? It's much better to dive into a crowded field than to try and sort of say something completely out there, but with a potential supervisor thinking, this might be interesting, but I just don't know if it could be done, and I don't know if there's a market for it, really. I don't know if anyone will be interested in this. So you've got to make sure that you're doing something that people are going to be willing to read and to think about. So more specifically for the statement of purpose, how important is it? It varies, but it's generally very important, especially for postgraduate research. Sometimes the statement of purpose can be written with input and support from a potential supervisor, but that would only really be true of a doctoral training program or a doctoral training centre. So that's where you're applying for a particular research group, and that's typically for the natural sciences. You need to, of course, make sure that the statement of purpose is clearly written with plain language and a clear structure. The best way to structure it is to use the framework from the How to Apply section of the website. So when you go onto your chosen course, under How to Apply, it will give you those bullet points that I showed you earlier, and you need to address all of those bullet points like you're applying for a job and connect to each of those. You do not need to use flowery, pompous, pretentious language. Keep it plain, keep it simple, right? Use an academic tone of voice is definitely going to be to your benefit. Okay, Unlike the undergraduate personal statement as mentioned, it needs to answer why Oxford. So I've already discussed this, but you've got to be very specific. Who at Oxford do you want to work with? Which modules, which specific resources, right? Go right into the weeds of it. It'll demonstrate that you're serious about Oxford, because a lot of people are applying like I had done in order to just to say they've gone to Oxford, rather than because Oxford was actually demonstrably the best place for them. And that's what I learnt second time around, and hopefully you'll get more of a sense of it first time around. Okay. You also need to give a sense of direction. So where are you going with this? What is your goal with this research? You don't necessarily need to give career aspirations, but you need to sort of give a sense of where you would like to contribute to your chosen field. You can give career plans, and that can be fine, but unless it sort of speaks to those bullet points on the how to apply section, then it won't necessarily help you. But just a sort of a sense that you can do it. Okay, so some final quickfire thoughts. Funding is obviously very important. This is an instance where you're going to have to do a lot of research, I'm afraid. This is not something I can summarize in 1 or even 20 videos because it's very complicated. Needless to say, there is a lot of support out there, and I will link it in the description. The key thing to have a look at is the fees and funding and scholarships search page for graduate admission at Oxford, where you can put in all of your criteria and you can find all sorts of funding opportunities. Bear in mind that in some cases, national governments will fund students to study at universities like Oxford. So go and have a look, go and do some homework, perhaps contact some people on LinkedIn who have studied at Oxford, who've come from the same country as you or from similar backgrounds, and find out how they managed to finance their studies. In my experience, people are very eager and willing to share their stories if it can help someone out. It is quite scary, of course, because the fees can be quite high for some of the postgraduate degrees, but there are lots of people out there who want to help you. We don't want the money that is available sitting around idly. We want it to be used. So go and have a look. It's worth noting, and this links to the second point, that some colleges have specific funding. So whilst the University of Oxford has scholarships tied to it, so too do individual colleges. So it can be worth looking around at those colleges. But generally speaking, college choice is not that impactful at a postgraduate level. Your relationship is much more clearly with a department or a faculty or a division rather than an individual college. What you would typically ask of a prospective student if they state a college preference is that there is somebody at that college who can oversee their studies, but that person may not actually be their supervisor. So that was my case. I was a student at Wadham College, but my DPhil supervisor was at St Hugh's College, but there was someone at Wadham who could oversee my work. I actually found my life at Wadham was incredibly enriching, so it did matter quite a lot to me that I was at that college, but generally speaking, people who end up at any college will find that place to be their home and they'll end up loving it. So I wouldn't overthink college choice. It's not terribly impactful on an academic level, and usually it works out very well for people in the end. Okay, and getting help is the last major point, and this is something that I was terrible at my first time around. I was still at university when I was applying, and I could have asked, the tutors for more help, and I should have done that. It would have made life a lot easier. I should have also reached out to Oxford and contacted potential advisors and supervisors and asked for their thoughts. I did that all second time around, and everyone was incredibly helpful. And I think I was just scared that no one would really want to help me. And it was just my insecurity getting in the way. But if I had asked for help, I would have received it, and it would have made my life a lot easier. So do please ask for help, including in the comments below if you need any. I can signpost you in the right direction, hopefully. Okay, and finally, sort of think very carefully about why you are or are not applying for graduate study at Oxford. My choice for applying in the first instance was just insecurity, and that was not a good reason. The much better reason emerged as I thought more clearly about why do I actually want to pursue postgraduate study, which was that I wanted to get into academic teaching. I wanted to find out more about politics. I was just in love with the subject. But I had allowed the brand of Oxford to blind me to some of those things. And that was a mistake, and that was my biggest mistake. But it's also worth sort of thinking about many people who don't apply to Oxford. We've got lots of great initiatives now to diversify postgraduate study at Oxford, things like Unique Plus and the Future Academics programme. And we want everyone to help us solve these intractable problems that are facing the world, and to help with the research and the thinking that goes on in Oxford. And for many people, they might be putting off applying to Oxford because they feel intimidated by the brand, or they might have heard some stories about it and they're a bit concerned. But my advice would be that, if you're in love with a particular subject, like I'm in love with politics, it'll do you no harm to have a go. And indeed, going through the process will teach you so much. I don't regret not getting in, because it rekindled my love of politics and it really helped me hone my skills. And it was an incredibly valuable experience for me. And, I would advise that to anyone. And it doesn't matter in the slightest if you're not admitted. It doesn't make you a worse person. It doesn't make you, unimportant. It just means that in the sort of specific job criteria for that particular course, you perhaps weren't as well fitting as someone else, but you will still have grown an awful lot as an individual. And I think that's the most important thing, is to just be absolutely clear why you want to apply and not allow yourself to get distracted by the fame of the brand, but actually apply for the right reasons, because you love a subject or because you want to think about it more deeply and you want to share that love with other people in the future. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. Do please let me know if you need any help in the comments below, and I look forward to speaking to you next time. Thanks so much. Bye now.